Close your eyes, dear listener. Let the noise of the day melt away. Allow each breath to slow, like a soft breeze drifting through ancient ruins. Tonight, we set sail to the painter of lost faces.
They said his brush was dipped not in oils, but in memory itself. The painter of lost faces was no ordinary artist. His name, if he ever had one, is forgotten. The whispers that survived him call him by many titles: the Eraser, the Silent One, the Shade Binder. But the most enduring is the painter of lost faces.
He first appeared in Europe at the dawn of the Renaissance, in a time when the world itself seemed to awaken from centuries of shadow. Florence bustled with merchants and philosophers. Rome struggled between holiness and corruption, and kings across Europe sought immortality through patronage of the arts.
But this man's work was different. He did not glorify rulers nor immortalize beauty. His paintings had a secret, one that terrified those who dared to look too long. When he captured a face upon his canvas, the world slowly began to forget the original.
Not all at once, not in a dramatic vanishing. It began subtly. A servant could no longer recall the mole upon his master's cheek. A wife forgot the exact shape of her husband's smile. Soon, portraits became the only evidence of their existence.
Some believed he had stolen secrets from the temples of Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, whose waters gave birth to both remembrance and oblivion. Others whispered he had bargained with the river Lethe, drinking its forgetful flow and binding it into his pigments. History leaves no certain trace. His canvases are said to lie scattered, locked in vaults, or hidden beneath churches, shunned by curators who fear what they might still contain. The only thing agreed upon is this: where the painter traveled, faces disappeared from memory, names slipped from chronicles, and lives dissolved into silence. Florence, 1479. The city of flowers was restless with ambition. In the shadow of Brunelleschi's dome, painters, sculptors, and thinkers competed for glory. The Medici family held court, collecting artists like gems, each brushstroke and marble carving a testament to their power.
Into this world of light walked a stranger. He was quiet, dressed in a manner that betrayed no homeland. His garments were simple, travel-worn, yet his eyes, gray, unfixed, as if always seeing something beyond, drew murmurs. He carried no apprentices, no sign of workshop, only a wooden case bound with iron clasps.
He lodged in a modest tavern near the Arno. By day, he walked the markets, observing pigments and panels, yet buying nothing. By night, a faint glow flickered from his rented room, and those who passed swore they heard the scratching of brush upon canvas, steady as a heartbeat. The city's painters noticed him. Florence was no stranger to visitors, but this one unsettled them. Botticelli's apprentices muttered that the stranger lingered too long before unfinished works, staring as if memorizing their subjects' souls. An aged friar claimed to have seen him sketching the face of a beggar. Yet the next morning, the beggar wandered the square, and none could recall his features. It was Lorenzo de' Medici himself who first spoke his name aloud in Florence's courts. Or rather, the absence of it. "There is a painter," Lorenzo said, "reclining amid poets and philosophers. A man without lineage, without workshop, who leaves only silence behind his brush. I sent a man to find his birthplace. No one remembers him. It is as though he stepped from a dream.
Some laughed, dismissing the story as another of Lorenzo's amusements. Yet within weeks, whispers spread. A merchant who had commissioned a portrait from the stranger discovered that his own children struggled to recall his face at the supper table. A servant swore she could not remember whether her master had a scar above his lip, though she had seen it every day of her service. Fear turned to fascination. Florence was a city hungry for wonders, and nothing was more wondrous or more dangerous than the thought of art that could undo memory itself.
The stranger was invited, reluctantly, into Florence's artistic circles. He did not compete in public displays of skill, nor did he boast of technique. When pressed, he would only murmur that his art came from older hands. When asked what he meant, he grew silent. But one night, at a gathering of artists beneath frescoed ceilings, a bold young scholar spoke. "They say you studied not in Florence, nor Venice, nor Rome. Some whisper you came from Byzantium, where icons are said to trap the soul itself. Tell us, painter, what lies in your box?"
The stranger looked up, his eyes pale in the lamplight. Slowly, he opened the wooden case at his side. Inside lay jars of pigment unlike any others. Their colors were muted, yet unsettling. Ashen whites, deep greens like river moss, blacks that seemed to swallow the flame of the candles. When he uncorked one, the room fell silent. A faint chill spread, though no wind stirred. "These," the painter said at last, "are not colors. They are fragments of forgetting." The scholars laughed uneasily, yet none forgot the weight of his words. In the weeks that followed, rumors grew. Some claimed the stranger's pigments were ground from the bones of forgotten saints, stolen from catacombs. Others swore he had gone to Delphi, where the last embers of the oracle whispered secrets of memory and oblivion. Whatever the truth, one fact remained. His paintings did not merely resemble their subjects, they consumed them. It began with a portrait. The merchant Giovanni Bellanti, a wealthy trader of silks, had been the first Florentine bold or foolish enough to commission the stranger. Giovanni was a man obsessed with legacy. He had carved his initials into stone lintels, stamped his crest upon every bolt of fabric, and hired poets to immortalize his name in verse. To him, a portrait was not mere vanity. It was a declaration of permanence in a world where plague and fire might erase all else. The stranger accepted the commission quietly, asking only that Giovanni sit for him 3 nights in succession. The sessions were held in Giovanni's own villa, under lamplight. Servants whispered that the painter worked with unnatural stillness, pausing only to dip his brush into those strange jars of pigment. His hand never trembled, never faltered, as though guided by something more certain than flesh. When the portrait was unveiled, Giovanni was overjoyed. The likeness was flawless, so flawless, in fact, that it seemed more real than reality. Every crease of his brow, every thread of his robe, every flicker of pride in his dark eyes was captured. Guests at the unveiling gasped, swearing the painted Giovanni breathed, that his chest might rise and fall if one looked long enough. Yet within days, something began to change. First, Giovanni's children grew hesitant when they called for him. One evening, his youngest son stared at him and whispered, "Father, why do you look different?"
The child pointed to the painting on the wall. "You look more like that than yourself."
Giovanni dismissed it as childish fancy, but soon his servants stumbled over their words, forgetting whether his hair curled at his temples or fell straight. His wife confessed that in the intimacy of night, she felt as if she were lying beside a stranger. The true horror revealed itself weeks later when Giovanni attended a council meeting. As he stood to speak, silence fell over the chamber. One of the elders frowned and asked, "Forgive me, sir, remind us who you are?" Giovanni sputtered with outrage. He had attended such councils for 20 years, yet as the day wore on, more colleagues looked at him with faint puzzlement, as though struggling to place his face. At home, he demanded his steward summon his portrait from the villa. The canvas was carried into the chamber, and there, painted in oils, Giovanni Belanti lived immortal. Every line of him remembered perfectly. The counselors recognized the portrait instantly, but when they turned their eyes to the man himself, they blinked in confusion. Their tongues faltered. It was as if the painting had become the true Giovanni, and the flesh and blood man only a shadow. Word spread quickly. Some dismissed the tale as slander, born of envy among rival merchants, but others whispered in awe. Had not poets often claimed that art granted immortality, that verse and paint outlast flesh? Perhaps this painter had merely carried the promise to its ultimate conclusion.
Artists debated in workshops and taverns. Botticelli himself, when told of the portrait, is said to have muttered, "To be remembered is to live twice, but to be forgotten is to die twice." Soon more commissions followed. A widow paid dearly to have her dead husband's face preserved. A soldier, scarred and weary, begged to have his youth captured. A courtesan, famed for her beauty, wished to make her radiance eternal. Each portrait was flawless. Each sitter, soon after, was less remembered. The widow's husband was spoken of only through his painting, never his deeds. The soldier returned to his comrades, who no longer recognized his voice. The courtesan found her admirers drifting to others, unable to recall what had once drawn to her side.
It was as though the world itself conspired to forget them. Records faded, names slipped from ledgers, even coins that bore their likeness seemed to tarnish quicker than others. Fear mingled with fascination. Some accused the painter of witchcraft, claiming his brush was cursed. Priests muttered of pacts with Lethe, the river of forgetting, which souls drank from before entering the afterlife. Others recalled darker myths, that of Persephone's descent into Hades, where faces of the living grew pale in memory, leaving only shades behind. But still, the commissions continued, for there were always those willing to risk oblivion if it meant a perfect reflection of themselves might endure. The Medici themselves began to take interest. Not openly, Lorenzo was too cautious to risk scandal, but in whispered inquiries, in careful notes passed between trusted hands. To control memory, after all, was greater than controlling armies.
Meanwhile, the painter remained a cipher. He accepted payment in gold, yet seemed to spend none of it. He lived modestly, his room lit by candle and haunted by unfinished canvases. Some nights, neighbors heard him murmuring as he worked, not in Italian nor Latin, but in a language older still, the syllables heavy as stone.
No apprentice stayed with him long. Those who tried fled within days, speaking of visions in the pigments, faces drifting like smoke, whispers of names they had never known. And always the paintings grew. By winter's end, Florence held more than a dozen faces no one could remember, preserved only in oils and silence.
It was then that scholars began to connect the stranger's works to older legends. One, a friar named Domenico, wrote in his journal, "I believe this man carries not the skill of art, but the weight of myth. The ancients spoke of Lethe, river of forgetting, whose waters cleanse memory. What if he has bound those waters into paint? Each stroke a sip of Lethe, each canvas a vessel of oblivion. If so, then he is not painter, but ferryman, guiding souls not into death, but into silence." The friar's journal survives, though stained with water and smoke. Its final pages speak of a journey he planned, to follow the painter, to see whence he drew his power. The journey, it seems, was never completed. Domenico vanished from records shortly after. And so the legend deepened. The painter of lost faces was no longer mere rumor. He had become a force whispered in Florence's taverns, feared in its churches, and courted in its palaces. Those who met him claimed he rarely blinked, as if his eyes did not tire. Others swore his shadow did not always match his form. But one truth was certain. Wherever he worked, memory faltered. Faces dimmed, names dissolved. And Florence, city of rebirth and light, felt the creeping chill of forgetting. The scholar Fra Domenico was not alone in his suspicions. Across Florence, whispers spread that the painter's works were not born of human craft, but of something older, something that belonged to the realm of myth. The Greeks, after all, had spoken often of memory and forgetting. To them, memory was divine. Mnemosyne, the goddess of remembrance, was mother of the muses, those patrons of art and poetry. Without memory, there could be no song, no story, no history. To forget was to unmake the world. But memory had its twin, a shadow running beneath it, Lethe, the river of oblivion. In the underworld, the souls of the dead drank from Lethe's waters to forget their past lives before being reborn. To drink deeply was to dissolve one's very identity, to shed the burden of time. Domenico, poring over cracked manuscripts in the library of Santa Maria Novella, found curious passages. One fragment of Orphic text warned initiates not to drink from Lethe, but instead to seek Mnemosyne's spring, to remember and thus transcend. Yet another hinted at secret rites in which fragments of Lethe's waters were captured, bound into ritual vessels, their power carried into the living world. Could the painter have found such a vessel? Could his pigments be Lethe distilled into color?
Florence was fertile ground for such speculations. The Renaissance was not only a rebirth of art, but of forgotten knowledge. Alchemists and humanists scoured ruins for scraps of Greece and Rome, seeking wisdom thought long lost. Marsilio Ficino, philosopher of the Medici circle, lectured that the soul could be drawn upward through harmonies and symbols, even as darker currents whispered of necromancy and forbidden rites. It was in this atmosphere that the painter's works took on mythic weight. Some called him a second Orpheus, not charming souls with song, but erasing them with color. Others likened him to Hades himself, drawing mortals into shadow. A few dared to mutter that he was no man at all, but an emissary of Lethe, walking in flesh
only to harvest memory. One night, Domenico confronted him. The friar found the painter alone in his chamber, candles guttering around an unfinished canvas. The image upon it was strange, not a face, but a pale oval, blurred and indistinct, as though the paint resisted form. "Tell me," Domenico demanded, voice trembling, "is it true you work with the river of Lethe?" The painter looked up. His gray eyes caught the candlelight like stone beneath water. "Names are rivers," he said softly. "Faces are rivers. All must flow into Lethe sooner or later. I only hasten what the world has already promised." The friar pressed on. "Then you are no artist. You are a thief of souls." The painter's expression did not change. He dipped his brush into a jar of black, so deep it seemed to swallow the flame. "You are mistaken, Father. I do not steal. I preserve. Without me, faces fade in dust and rot. With me, they live eternally upon canvas. Only the flesh is forgotten." Domenico recoiled, crossing himself. Yet a terrible thought gripped him. Was this not, in some twisted way, the dream of every artist? To capture what time would destroy, to bind what death would erase. He fled the chamber before the canvas could claim him. Days later, Domenico vanished from Florence, leaving only his fragmented journal. Some said he had gone north, pursuing rumors of the painter's origin. Others believed he had already been painted, and thus erased.
Meanwhile, new myths twined with old. Storytellers whispered that when the painter worked, faint ripples could be heard, like water lapping in a hidden cave. Children were warned not to look too long at his canvases, lest their own reflections begin to waver in mirrors. Women crossing bridges over the Arno muttered prayers, fearful of the river below, no longer seeing it as water, but as a shadow of Lethe's current, waiting to swallow them whole. The Medici philosophers debated in hushed tones. Could memory truly be undone? Ficino himself is rumored to have remarked, "If this man holds Lethe in his brush, then beware, for to govern memory is to govern history. A forgotten man is no rival. A forgotten deed is no sin. With enough forgetting, even truth itself may vanish." Yet even as fear grew, so too did desire. Patrons came not merely to be painted, but to be forgotten. An adulterer wished his sins erased. A bankrupt sought to vanish from creditors' books. A widow begged to have the pain of her grief blotted out, offering herself as subject so her sorrow might dissolve with her. The painter obliged them all, working silently, tirelessly. For every face remembered upon his canvas, another was lost to the world's memory. Florence glittered with art, yet shadows of forgetting lengthened across its streets.
And still, no one knew from whence he came. Some swore he had arrived from Constantinople, carrying relics salvaged when the city fell to the Turks. Others claimed he was seen in Venice decades before, painting sailors who were later lost at sea. A Venetian chronicler wrote of a man whose portraits left wives unable to recall their husbands' features when ships failed to return. But oldest of all were the Greek whispers that once, long ago, a painter had sat at the banks of Lethe itself, dipping his brush into the river until even the gods looked away.
Whether the man in Florence was that same painter reborn, or another who had stolen his craft, none could say. Only this was certain. The painter of lost faces was no mere mortal with oils and canvas. He was a vessel of myth, a bridge between art and oblivion. And Florence, city of memory and rebirth, had welcomed him into its heart.
Florence thrived on beauty, but it was power that truly shaped the city. Behind every fresco, every marble statue, every poem sung in the piazza, there pulsed the influence of the Medici, bankers who became princes, weaving gold into the fabric of politics. Lorenzo de' Medici, called Il Magnifico, was a man who understood both art and power better than most. He collected not merely for beauty's sake, but because he knew that memory was the foundation of dominion. To be remembered was to rule forever. To be forgotten was to vanish as if one had never drawn breath. So when whispers reached Lorenzo's ears that a painter had arrived who could command memory itself, who could make faces vanish from the living while fixing them eternally in oils, his curiosity sharpened into something keener. For weeks he observed from a distance, sending agents to commission small works, noting the effects. One such agent, a minor cousin, reported back in a trembling hand, "The portrait is perfect, yet my wife cannot recall my face without it. She stares at me as though I were a stranger. Even my children forget me at times. I beg you, cousin, do not traffic further with this man. His brush is poison."
But to Lorenzo, poison was often a tool, deadly in the wrong hand, priceless in the right. At last, under the pretense of patronage, he summoned the painter to his palazzo. The hall was a marvel of marble and fresco, filled with philosophers, poets, and courtiers. Yet, when the painter entered, silence fell. He was unadorned, his garments plain, his step soft upon the polished floor. Only the wooden case of pigments, clutched like a reliquary, betrayed his purpose. Lorenzo rose from his chair, his eyes sharp with curiosity. "Florence is rich with artists," he said, "yet none are spoken of as you. Tell me, stranger, what gift is it you carry, that memory itself bends before your brush?" The painter inclined his head. "It is no gift, my lord. It is a current. I merely paint with waters that flow beneath all things." "Waters?" Lorenzo asked, his voice low. "You speak of Lethe."
The painter neither confirmed nor denied. Lorenzo studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled, the smile of a man who saw opportunity gleaming where others saw peril. "You will paint for me," Lorenzo said at last. "Not my own face. No, I need no reminder of myself. But Florence is a city of rivals. Some are too loud, too ambitious. They trouble the harmony I have built. Paint them, and the city shall forget them. Their names will fade from memory, their faces dissolve into nothing. Florence will be mine in truth, not just in name." Around the chamber, courtiers shifted uneasily. To forget an enemy was more dangerous than killing him. A corpse could be avenged. A forgotten man left no echo, no lineage, no claim. The painter's eyes, pale as smoke, flickered with something unreadable. He said, "Faces are rivers. They flow whether I guide them or not, but if you command it, I will paint." And so began the Medici's bargain.
The first commission was subtle.
A rival merchant who sought to undercut Medici trade awoke one morning to find his household unmoored. His servants no longer recognized him. His partners failed to greet him by name. Within a month, his contracts dissolved, his wealth scattered, his name lost from the ledgers of Florence. All that remained was a portrait hidden in Lorenzo's vault, a painted face remembered by no one. Encouraged, Lorenzo pressed further. One by one, his rivals were undone, not by blade or poison, but by silence. Chroniclers found gaps in their records. Priests forgot to inscribe their deaths. Families wandered in confusion, unable to recall why a chair sat empty at the supper table. Florence's memory shifted, and with it, Lorenzo's power deepened. But such bargains are never without cost. Some whispered that the city itself began to change. Frescoes crumbled more swiftly. Names carved in stone weathered away. Letters on manuscripts faded as if scrubbed by invisible hands. It was as though Florence, touched by the painter's brush, drank too deeply of Lethe.
Even Lorenzo was not untouched. One evening, while walking in his garden, he overheard two children at play. They were speaking of the city's ruler, not of Lorenzo de' Medici, but of some vague Magnifico whose features they could not describe. He felt a chill, realizing that even as his rivals vanished, so too might he one day dissolve, his name blurring into myth rather than history. He summoned the painter in secret. "Tell me," Lorenzo demanded, "can a man choose which memories fade and which endure? Can I ensure Florence forgets my enemies, yet remembers me?" The painter studied him in silence. Then he spoke with the calm of a man reciting a truth older than kings. "No man commands Lethe. All rivers reach the sea. To forget others is to risk forgetting yourself." Lorenzo's face hardened. For the first time, doubt touched him. Yet he did not cast the painter out. Power was too intoxicating. Florence thrived under his hand, and his enemies dwindled like mist at dawn. Still, he began to hedge his bets, commissioning poets to write endlessly of him, sculptors to carve his likeness, architects to raise monuments in his name. He would anchor himself in stone and verse, lest the painter's current sweep him away. But others had begun to notice. Scholars from Venice, envoys from Rome, even wandering mystics from the East spoke of a man whose portraits undid memory. And where scholars and mystics gather, so too does the Church. The whispers of witchcraft could no longer be ignored.
The Inquisition, though not yet at its height, cast long shadows. Savonarola, the fiery Dominican, would soon rise in Florence, denouncing all vanity and corruption. To such men, the painter of lost faces was not artist, but heretic, a corrupter of God's gift of memory. And so, while Lorenzo bargained with the painter in gilded halls, darker forces began to stir. Priests whispered of curses, monks scoured scripture for signs, and envoys rode north to Rome with tidings of a man who could erase souls with brush and pigment. The Medici's bargain, it seemed, had awakened not only ambition, but judgment. And the painter, silent as ever, continued to work, his brush carrying Florence deeper into forgetting. Florence could not contain him forever. By the spring of 1481, the painter was gone. Some said Lorenzo had dismissed him, fearing the danger of being forgotten himself.
Others claimed the church had pressed too close, and the stranger vanished before inquisitors could act. A few whispered he simply drifted onward, like the current of Lethe itself, never rooted, always flowing. But his trail was not lost. In Venice, a city of water and reflection, his legend deepened. Merchants swore that a silent stranger had appeared among the glass blowers of Murano, studying their mirrors with unnerving attention. Soon after, portraits began to surface among the patrician houses, works so lifelike that husbands could not recall their wives' faces without them, and senators forgot one another's names mid-debate. One senator, desperate to preserve his legacy, locked his portrait in a vault beneath San Marco. Yet when he died, no chronicler remembered to inscribe his name. His monument still stands in a Venetian church, its inscription blank, as if the stone itself had forgotten who it honored. Fishermen told darker tales. They claimed the painter walked along the canals at night, staring into the water as though listening. Some swore they saw ripples where none should be, as if the lagoon itself whispered with the voice of Lethe. Mothers warned their children not to look into the canals, lest their reflections slip away and never return. By the time Venice realized what had passed through its waters, the stranger was gone again.
From Venice he moved north to the kingdom of Bohemia, where Prague's winding streets and Gothic spires already thrummed with legend. Alchemists crowded the court of King Wenceslaus, chasing the philosopher's stone and secrets of eternity. To them, the painter was not an artist, but a revelation, a man who had discovered a formula to erase matter not with fire or acid, but with silence. One alchemist, Rabbi Judah Low, who would later be remembered for the tale of the golem, wrote of a wandering image maker who carried the shadow of Lethe in his jars. Though Low did not name him, he warned that such a force was not creation, but uncreation, and that meddling with it was to tempt God's wrath. Yet Prague's nobles could not resist. They invited the painter into their castles, offering gold, jewels, even manuscripts of forbidden lore. He painted them one by one, leaving their faces radiant upon canvas while their names slipped from memory. Within years, the annals of Bohemia recorded inexplicable gaps, lords with no lineage, treaties signed by men no one could describe. And always, the painter moved on before suspicion grew too sharp.
By the late 1480s, he surfaced in Paris. The French court was dazzled by Italian influence, hungry for art and innovation. Yet even amid its splendor, his presence unsettled. A chronicler in Paris wrote, "There is among us a man who paints with shadows. I have seen his works, and though they are finer than any I have known, I fear them. For when I look upon them, I remember too much, and when I look away, I remember nothing at all." Here, too, his portraits rocked silence. A noble family once famed for their beauty dwindled into obscurity, their estates passed on with no heirs remembered. A poet painted by him vanished from anthologies, his verses preserved only because they had been copied under another's name. Some linked the painter to alchemists who dabbled in memory, men who believed that to forget was to ascend beyond mortal sorrow. They whispered that he had bargained with Hecate at a crossroads, trading his own name for mastery of remembrance. Others said he was pursued by angels, who erased his trail as he worked so that no history might hold him too tightly. Paris, like Venice and Prague before it, awoke too late. The painter slipped away, leaving only echoes, only faces on canvas that no living man or woman could place.
By the turn of the century, his legend had spread farther than his footsteps. Merchants in London spoke of him as a ghost who painted kings into shadows. In Lisbon, sailors swore he had painted captains who vanished at sea, their crews forgetting their names even as storms raged. In the markets of Cairo, travelers claimed he had once studied the tombs, learning from hieroglyphs how to bind faces against time. Scholars tried to trace him, but the task was maddening. Records blurred, letters faded. Entire households seemed to vanish wherever he stayed too long. It was as though history itself resisted his capture, erasing his trail as quickly as it was written. And yet, always, there was the same pattern. A man without a name, carrying a wooden case of strange pigments, faces captured perfectly in oils, subjects forgotten in flesh. He was everywhere and nowhere, a shadow across Europe, flowing like the river whose name none dared speak too loudly. But with each city he touched, opposition grew. In Florence, Savonarola began to thunder against vanities, claiming paintings themselves were snares for the soul. In Rome, inquisitors whispered of a heretic who stole memory. In Prague, mystics sought to bind his works in iron chests. The painter of lost faces had become more than man or myth. He had become a question. Could memory itself be trusted? Could history endure when a brushstroke might undo it? And so the hunt began.
By the early 1500s, Europe was aflame with fear. The old world trembled. Wars tore across Italy, kings vied for crowns, and whispers of heresy spread faster than ink. In towns and villages, fires burned in public squares, where women accused of witchcraft were tied and left to ash. It was in this climate that the painter surfaced for the last time. In Lorraine, where the forests pressed close and rivers cut like veins through the land, a woman stood trial for sorcery. She was known only as Madeleine. The villagers swore she had spoken to shadows, that milk soured at her glance, that children who played by her hut forgot their own names. When inquisitors searched her home, they found a portrait, unfinished, uncanny, its subject half-formed, half-vanished. The brushstrokes bore the unmistakable mark of him. They demanded to know who had painted it. Madeleine, calm in her chains, whispered, "He comes to those who are already forgotten. He came to me." The court called her mad. Yet in the crowd, some shifted uneasily. The legend of the nameless painter had reached even here. On the morning of her execution, a stranger entered Lorraine. He was described differently by every witness. Some said tall and gaunt, others young and sharp, others old and bent. Yet all agreed on two details. He carried a wooden case of paints, and his eyes seemed as though they had seen the underworld. He requested to paint Madeleine before the flames took her. The magistrates, curious and cruel, allowed it. Perhaps they hoped to trap him, to catch the devil's servant in the act. And so, in the shadow of the gallows he worked,
brush upon canvas, silence deepened. The crowd grew restless. Some forgot why they had gathered. Others forgot the very name of the woman bound before them. When the portrait was complete, Madeline's face shone alive upon the canvas, serene, eternal. On the scaffold, the woman slumped, nameless, forgotten before the fire ever touched her. The painter closed his case and walked away. None stopped him. By evening, not a soul in Lorraine could recall what crime had been punished, nor whose ashes smoldered in the square. That was the last sighting. From that day forward, the painter of lost faces disappeared from history. No further portraits surfaced, no further cities whispered of him. His trail ended in Lorraine, as though the river Leith itself had claimed him at last. But his works remained, hidden in vaults, buried in monasteries, sealed in private collections. They lingered. Each painting bore a perfect face, and yet no name, no history. Families forgot their ancestors. Dynasties crumbled into obscurity. Chronicles skipped over chapters as though ink had dissolved. Art historians debate still. Was he a myth? An invention of fearful minds in an age of upheaval? Was he a wandering genius lost to history? Or was he, as the ancients whispered, a vessel of Leith, carrying forgetfulness across the world?
In certain galleries of Europe, there are portraits without plaques, paintings too masterful to be anonymous. They hang in corners, eyes following the viewer, lips poised as if to speak. No record tells who painted them. No memory recalls who they portray. But when you stand too long before them, a strange silence creeps in. You forget your errand, your companions' names, even the sound of your own breath. And just for an instant, you feel as though the brushstroke itself has reached out, erasing you. And perhaps it has. For the painter of lost faces was never gone. He waits in canvas. He waits in shadow. And if you look too closely, perhaps he waits for you.